Looking forward to this, another fireside chat, which is going to be a little bit two-pronged. We're looking at the topic of health equity, but we're going to illustrate this from some of the learnings and initiatives that are coming out of plasma-derived therapies. I don't think I need to introduce myself again, but Giles, please can you tell the audience a bit more about your background?
Yeah, my name is Giles Platford. I'm president of Takeda Global Plasma-Derived Therapies business. I'm also chair of the Global Executive Board of the Plasma Protein Therapeutics Association. I've been close to 25 years in the industry, 15 years with Takeda and 10 years on the executive team in varying roles. So happy to be here with you today, Charlotte.
Thanks, Giles. I suppose we'll start with hearing a bit more about Takeda's approach to health equity and your perspective on that.
Well, I mean, it's clearly a big issue, health equity, and the numbers speak for themselves. I mean, the difference between the average life expectancy in the poorest countries versus the richest countries is about 34 years, or up to that level. Now, that's obviously clearly unacceptable. And many of those, if I can say, premature deaths could be avoided if there was more equitable access to healthcare and to medicines. And that's why I joined this industry. That's why I've stayed in the industry. And that's why I'm very fortunate to work for a company like Takeda, where we really do put the patient first, where we really do think about how we can make our medicines more accessible, but also strengthen health systems to ensure that medicines more broadly are accessible to patients. And our aspiration is that no matter where a patient sits in the world, whichever country they're in or which part of a country they're in, they should have equitable access to care and to treatment. And that's clearly not the case today. And that's why we've put a lot of effort over the past decade into really strengthening our access to medicines program. And I've been a part of that in the early part of my tenure on the team. We've got health system strengthening programs to build capacity in over 80 countries around the world. And we try to address affordability for our medicines and access to our medicines by putting patient assistance programs in place. And we have those around 20 countries, typically more developing health systems in the world, to ensure that we're both strengthening health systems and addressing the affordability and access issue. And one other thing I would say is that since a lot of our portfolio, as well our innovative pipeline, is addressing areas of high unmet medical need, and these are typically sort of subset populations of patients suffering from orphan and rare designated diseases, we do partner a lot with institutions like Eurordis and NORD, the National Organization for Rare Disorders, to advocate for high impact initiatives like improving access to genomic sequencing, or improving access to specialized care for rare diseases, improving access to research and clinical studies, all of which can help improve diagnosis and access to treatment.
So I'd like to zoom in a bit on the plasma-derived therapy space and exactly the learnings we can pull out from the initiatives that are taking place there. But for anyone in the audience that might not be familiar with what plasma-derived therapies are, could you give us a primer on what this is exactly and some of the unique challenges that you're facing in that space?
Sure. So plasma is the yellow straw-colored liquid that comprises about 2/3 of blood. It contains thousands of proteins, some of which are deficient in patients suffering from rare, complex, chronic disorders like primary immunodeficiencies. Now, these patients suffer many of the same challenges and burdens that other rare disease patients suffer. Inability to get access to appropriate specialized care, thereby inability to get a proper diagnosis in a timely fashion, and also inability to get access to appropriate treatment. The nuance with plasma-derived therapies and those patients that depend on them is that we can only get plasma from a single source, which is healthy human donors. Now, the demand for plasma-derived therapies continues to increase. A primary immunodeficiency patient will probably need somewhere in the region of 130 donations to sustain their immunoglobulin treatment for the course of a year. The number of primary immunodeficiency patients getting diagnosed every year is increasing substantially. Equally, standard of care is improving in developing countries. New therapeutic applications are being discovered in secondary immunodeficiencies and polyneuropathies. And so the demand is increasing 5 to 8% every year, but we're unable today to be able to collect enough plasma to be able to support the needs of those patients. And we collect as an industry together, also with the public sector, about 80 million liters of plasma a year. That's still not enough. And so we're permanently in a situation where every day we're making delicate decisions around which country gets how much plasma. And to do that equitably is something we strive for, but it's a big challenge, and it's something that's unique to plasma-derived therapies and perhaps vaccines.
So I know, having spoken to you and you know my touch points with the PPTA, that there aren't enough countries that are participating in that collection, and there's an ambition to have improved public and private sector involvement to really drive that awareness. What is Takeda's approach to the role that they're playing in improving that and addressing the supply chain challenge?
Well, so Charlotte, policy is a big part of it. A big part of it. Now, we strive to ensure that we have legislation and policies that are as inclusive as possible, and that includes harmonizing regulatory frameworks. And I'll give you an illustration. I'm British by birth. I haven't lived in the UK for close to 25 years. Until very recently, I was not allowed to donate plasma either in Europe or the US because of, and you're probably familiar with this, mad cow's disease that was an endemic in the UK during the 80s and 90s. Now, there's no scientific rationale today as to why a British citizen would not be safe in donating plasma, but until very recently, the FDA and EMA would not accept UK plasma. Now, that recently changed. I've been able to start donating, but this is some of the work we do is trying to make the regulatory environment and the policy frameworks inclusive. But also, 90% of the world's plasma comes from 5 countries, the majority of which comes from, 70% comes from the US. The balance of that 90% comes from 4 countries in Europe, and it's no coincidence that those 5 countries that represent 90% of all plasma collection, the private sector is active through plasmapheresis in collecting plasma, and there are appropriate frameworks in place to enable that. So part of what we've been doing is recently, for example, with the substance of human origin legislation that went through consultation with the EU Parliament, is advocating for text in that legislation that actively encourages and promotes all EU member states to do their part and to address the deficiency that we have today. 40% of the plasma used to support some 300,000 patients in Europe dependent on these therapies comes from the US. So having a framework at a European level that encourages countries to do their part is important. And not only that, but empowers them to do it in a way that makes sense for that population in terms of the maximum amount of donations that a donor can make in a week, for example, or in a year. The appropriate compensation for the time and inconvenience. And it is important. Anybody who's donated blood would know probably you're spending 15 minutes every quarter. If you're donating plasma, it can be sometimes once a week for an hour. So some level of fair compensation has been proven to be an appropriate incentive and recognition to ensure we get sufficient volumes.
So we've heard over the 3 days of the conference about the importance and the value of key partners in driving some of these efforts. Could you tell us a bit more about how you're approaching partnerships or any key collaborations you've got in place to start driving this effort? Well,
I love this topic, and I love that Steven just gave a couple of really powerful examples in his presentation. So kudos to AstraZeneca for that. I think beyond policy, partnering to strengthen health systems, particularly strengthening, in our case, the plasma ecosystem in less developed health systems, is really, really important. And we've got a great example where we're collaborating with UNITAR, which is the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. I was told it would be off not to have at least one slide, so I have one slide here that you can look at the QR code here and find out a bit more about this collaboration. But we work with UNITAR, leveraging their expertise in training and developing nations towards developing innovative solutions that are tailored towards their country and addressing unmet needs. And this is a high unmet area of need. We're piloting in Malaysia in Argentina. We've got their expertise in training and development, Takeda's expertise in plasma.
Yeah.
We've engaged IPOPI, who are the International Patient Organization for Primary Immunodeficiencies. And together, we're looking at how do we source plasma in Argentina and Malaysia? How do we get that plasma fractionated? How do we ensure then sustainable access policies to recognize the value of those plasma therapies and create an ecosystem that gives sustainable access to the patients in those countries to these much needed therapies? And through the establishment of Plasma for Life, which is a knowledge hub accessible to other countries, other developing health systems can leverage those learnings and look at solutions that are suitable for them.
Thanks, Giles, for this example. I hope you've all managed to snap the QR code. We can make that available to you as well if you'd like to get your hand on that resource. I think we'd be remiss not to address the topic of how data, digital tech can start to drive some of these efforts. Perhaps we could look at what's happening and in terms of leveraging those technologies in plasma-derived therapies, but also in wider health equity efforts.
Absolutely, Charlotte. So, I mean, we face the same challenges from a health equity perspective in ensuring accessibility of our medicines in terms of affordability, but also in terms of ability to collect enough plasma to ensure that there's sufficient supply. The two go hand in hand, and the economics of plasma are incredibly different, and this contributes, of course, to the cost of those medicines. It's highly capital intensive, human capital intensive, incredibly complex, very voluminous. You're talking about millions of liters of plasma that need to be processed, and all of that comes at a cost. The more we can bring that cost down, the more that can be passed on then and ensure sustainable, affordable medicines that are accessible worldwide. And data, digital, and technology can help enormously in doing that. If you look at what we're doing in our collection centers, how we engage with donors, improve loyalty of donors so they can keep coming back, making the process of registration as seamless as possible, working through the center as quickly as possible. All of that helps to develop a retained sort of loyal donor base, and that avoids dependence on the high cost of acquiring new donors. Making our centers more productive, improving bed utilization and capacity utilization. There's a lot that you can do with AI to improve scheduling, to smooth demand curves, to leverage AI to do workforce capacity planning. All of that helps to drive efficiency, which helps to drive productivity, reduce cost, and ultimately reduce the cost of these medicines in automated visual inspection in manufacturing and reducing batch turnover time. Data digital is used extensively. And one thing I would say as well is downstream in terms of burden of administration for patients. Given the volumes of plasma that need to be, or the plasma-derived therapies that need to be administered, typically this requires for some diseases going into an infusion center or a hospital or a clinic to get infused, and it takes a few hours. Now, depending on where you live, in which country, if you're on an island in Indonesia or wherever it might be, that can be quite burdensome. So the more we can do to ensure that we're innovating with device administration technology, with smart pumps, with apps that empower patients to be able to administer at home and not need to make a trip to an infusion center or a clinic, that's also helping to make access to these medicines more equitable for all, regardless of where you live.
Great. Thanks, Charles. We'll jump to your questions in a moment, so I suppose the team can start to get that up, but just to wrap off our portion of the discussion, what's coming next for you? What are you really excited about as you strive to improve health equity, especially for plasma-derived therapy patients?
Well, we'll continue to invest in expanding capacity as our peers do, and I think we're very committed to that, and it's a priority for Takeda. We'll continue to partner. We'll continue to advocate for appropriate policy frameworks that recognize the value of plasma-derived therapies and make access to these therapies more equitable. I think the audience, how many people here have donated plasma in your life? Anyone? Beautiful. Round of applause for those that have. There's something you can do. If I can do a call to action, if you haven't donated plasma, it's a very noble thing to do, and I hope you'll find the experience as seamless as possible, and that goes for other organs and blood as well. The other call to action I would have is anybody here working in a company or an NGO or as a policymaker, partnering, public-private partnerships, partnering between sectors. This is the way to make things happen and to do that in a sustainable manner. So I would just put that as a call to action as well.
Thanks, Giles. Great. All right, let's get to some of your audience questions. Highest voted so far. Would it be possible to collect plasma from less developed regions?
It is possible, and we're actively advocating for that, particularly if you've got larger populations that could potentially have an impact in terms of volume at a global scale. Equally, if it's just addressing self-sufficiency in that country. And there are many different mechanisms to collect plasma. Private collection through plasmapheresis with compensation is not the only method, but it's a method that's proven to work at scale. But we're actively in discussions with a number of, let's say, LMIC countries to look at whether appropriate investment in infrastructure for plasmapheresis would be something that would make sense for them to address their own needs for plasma-derived therapies, but also potentially to contribute to global supply of plasma. So absolutely is the answer to that.
Great.
But it does require harmonization of regulatory frameworks globally. You can't just start sourcing plasma from a country and ship it to the US or to Europe for fractionation. It needs regulatory structure.
Of course. Next question. Through the blood donor system in the UK, people can donate plasma for free. Do you know if this goes to plasma-derived therapies or into NHS research?
I think it goes into both. And as I said earlier, we've been very actively working to ensure that UK plasma is eligible for use also for plasma-derived therapies sold in Europe and in the US, and that is now the case. And I think that's a big win from an advocacy and policy perspective, regulatory perspective. And we will be working with the government in the UK to see what more we can do to collect more plasma in the UK to benefit from that regulatory change.
Great. I know you've already highlighted the progress in legislation, but what would be the key driver to increase plasma availability in Europe?
Well, the substance of human origin legislation that will come into effect in 3 years' time, but is now final in terms of its text and drafting after several years of consultation, does a lot because it does actively speak to the compatibility of compensation for plasma with the principles of voluntary unpaid donation. It speaks to the ability of country governments and ministries of health to determine appropriate frequency, even if that goes beyond the EDQM average guidelines. So I think more countries will start doing what Austria, Czechia, Hungary, Germany have already done, and that's allowing more investment in infrastructure for plasma sourcing. And in fact, I was in Athens just this week, and we had the Minister of Health speak at our plasma protein conference, and he was firmly resolute in his commitments to invest in appropriate plasma ecosystem and infrastructure in Greece, and I hope we'll see more countries doing the same thing.
Great. Very impressive to see Takeda taking leadership and bringing innovation to plasma value chain. Can you elaborate what's the one most exciting initiative?
Well, it's difficult always to choose one, but I am very excited about what we're doing to leverage data, digital, and technology in our plasma collection centers. We have 250 centers collecting plasma around US. In Europe, it's a huge infrastructure with significant volumes and millions of donors coming through our doors, for which we're incredibly grateful. But what we're doing to improve the experience of those donors and how we outreach to engage with them, make the process of administration and registration as easy as possible and seamless through the center and after their visit is really transformational. It's stuff that's quite pioneering in biopharma, because typically you can't have that level of engagement with patients that we would have with our donors. So it's a lot of new ground for us as a biopharmaceutical company that's not in consumer health and isn't accustomed to dealing with consumers, but it's very exciting how we're leveraging AI and technology to improve that engagement, which will have a direct impact on patients because you're able to create a more loyal donor base.
Here's a nice one. Can we see a time when synthetic or lab-grown plasma will be the answer?
Well, we're seeing development of recombinant albumin, which is one of the key proteins fractionated off from plasma, already in China. We'll probably see approval at least in liver cirrhosis, which is a small indication, but a start, if you like, in China within the next couple of years. And we are seeing recombinant therapies, innovative recombinant therapies coming through in disease areas that until now have been 100% dependent on plasma-derived therapies, and that's something that I'm incredibly excited about. And Takeda, of course, I mean, plasma-derived therapies is 20% of our global portfolio, but we're also innovating in disease areas where we currently have plasma-derived therapies available for patients to bring recombinant therapies through, and I know others are doing the same. So,
great. Well, we're out of time for the audience questions, so please do grab Giles after this, but we have time for my favorite question, which is who would be your dream dinner guest?
I was thinking about that earlier. I was thinking, should I choose a regulator or a policymaker? I'd say Mick Jagger, probably.
Yeah,
I think
cool.
He's a super, super interesting guy who's seen a lot of things and met a lot of interesting people. I would have said the Queen, rest in peace, but yeah.
Thanks, Giles. Thanks so much for joining us.
Views expressed in this podcast are those of individuals being interviewed and do not reflect any company, parent company, or affiliates they represent.